28 days. That's all the letter gave him. 28 days before the bank took 140 acres that had been in his family since 1904, because a stranger with a clipboard stood in his grandfather's kitchen and said 4 words that should have ended everything. There is no water. But the stranger was wrong, and the proof of it was already sitting in that house. 6 words, written in pencil, by a dead man, in a ledger nobody had opened in almost 40 years. Nobody had read it right. Not once. Not in 87 years. By the time this story ends, a piece of land the bank had already written off as worthless would be worth more than double what it started at. And the reason would be standing in cedar brush so thick, most men wouldn't have lasted an hour searching it. This is the story of the driest ranch in the county, and the one line of pencil that saved it. If stories like this are the reason you're here, subscribe now, because what Walter Colby found underground is not something you'll want to miss. And tell me, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? The adjuster didn't sit down. He didn't set his briefcase on the table. He stood over the survey map, tapped it twice with one finger, and said it like he'd said it 100 times before to 100 other families. Mr. Colby, this ranch has no legal water source. It doesn't qualify for the drought bond. The ceiling fan turned slow in the August heat. Nobody spoke. Behind the house, past the tree line, 35 acres of cedar brush sat exactly as it had for 40 years. Silent, tangled, and hiding the one thing that could save everything. It was the summer of 1991, out past Comfort, Texas, where the limestone comes up through grass like bone through skin. Walter Colby was 31 years old, and he had been running his grandfather's ranch alone for 3 years, ever since his father's heart gave out mid-repair on a fence line, and nobody found him until the sun had already gone down. 140 acres, 40 of open pasture, 35 of cedar brush thick enough to lose a truck in, 40 of hard caliche hillside that had never grown a single thing worth harvesting, and 25 acres along a creek bed that hadn't carried water in Walter's lifetime. Not once, not even in the wet years. Town folks called him the quiet Colby boy, the kind who'd rather fix a windmill by lantern light at midnight than explain to anyone why it needed fixing in the first place. What they didn't know, what nobody had ever bothered to ask, was that Walter had spent 4 winters transcribing his grandfather's ranch ledgers before the old man passed. Every water right, every fence line, every clipped, pencil-scratched note, copied by hand into fresh pages, so the ink wouldn't fade to nothing. He had read that land's paper trail more times than any banker in that county ever would in their whole career. The ranch carried a note of $11,400. Without a documented, permitted water source, the new federal drought relief bond wouldn't touch it. And without the bond, the bank was calling the note due in 60 days, 20 of which were already gone by the time the adjuster's letter hit Walter's mailbox. A drilled well, by the 2 quotes he'd gathered that week, would run somewhere between $12,000 and $14,500 once you count the casing and the pump house. Hauling water through a Texas summer, at that year's rate, would cost close to $60 a day, money that didn't exist. Either option meant selling off 2/3 of his herd, and Walter had already buried one Colby that decade. He was not ready to bury the cattle too. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under lamplight, the same page he'd read 100 times before, and for the first time he actually saw it. One line, copied faithfully from the original 1904 land granted to every ledger since, dismissed by every surveyor and every neighbor who'd ever laid eyes on it. Thence north by the Deer Trail to the Split Oak, water at the Split Oak, thence west by the Ridge. The county surveyor had laughed about that very line, years earlier, standing in the same kitchen. Old-timers marked their corners by whatever tree happened to be standing, he'd said. Doesn't mean there's anything left to find. But Walter's grandfather hadn't been a man who wasted words. He was the kind of rancher who wrote fence, 3 posts, north 40 if 3 words got the job done. A man like that didn't spend ink writing the word water next to a tree unless water had mattered enough, once, for somebody to need finding again. The Split Oak wasn't a boundary marker. It never had been. It was a message, buried in a ledger for 87 years, waiting for someone who knew how to actually read it. And there was a problem. There hadn't been a split oak standing on that ranch in Walter's entire lifetime, not one he'd ever laid eyes on, which meant somewhere out in 35 acres of cedar brush so thick a man could get turned around in it in under 10 minutes. There was a dead tree nobody had looked at twice in 40 years. And underneath it, if his grandfather's handwriting could still be trusted, there was water that hadn't seen daylight since before Walter was born. He closed the ledger, pulled his boots on. 11 o'clock at night, flashlight in one hand, 28 days left on the clock, and Walter Colby walked out toward the tree line, not knowing if he was about to save the ranch or waste the only time he had left chasing a tree that had died before he'd ever taken his first breath. What he found in that brush 3 nights later would change everything the bank thought it knew about that land. The first split oak he found was the wrong one. Walter spent 2 full nights on it, clearing brush by flashlight, cutting back thorn vine until his forearms were striped red, digging at the base of a dead stump he was almost certain was the one. Nothing. Dry caliche, dry roots, dry all the way down. On the 3rd night, kneeling in the dirt with his hands raw and 25 days left on the clock, he almost gave up on the whole idea, almost decided his grandfather's ledger was exactly what the surveyor had always said it was, an old man's way of marking a corner, nothing more. Then he saw the second stump. It sat lower on the slope than he'd expected, half swallowed by cedar that had grown up thick around it over the decades, and split clean down the middle, the way lightning splits a tree. The 2 halves rotted black and leaning apart like a door left open. Around the base, a ring of young oak saplings had come up on their own, the way trees do when a parent tree drops its last acorns before it dies. Walter had walked past that exact spot a dozen times in his life, and never once looked twice. He knelt down and cleared 40 years of leaf litter back with his bare hands. The ground underneath was cooler than the ground around it, darker, and when he dug, the trowel came up heavy with mud instead of dust. He set an old feed bucket under the wettest spot and left it overnight. In the morning, there were 6 inches of water sitting in the bottom. 6 inches wasn't a ranch-saving discovery. 6 inches was barely enough to interest a raccoon, but it was 6 inches of water that shouldn't have existed at all. Not on a piece of ground the county, the bank, and every neighbor in a 10-mile radius had already called bone dry. Walter drove into town the next morning, not to see the banker, but to see Ray Delgado, 74 years old, half blind in one eye, and the last man left in that county who'd built stone spring boxes by hand before anybody owned a drill rig strong enough to go deep. Ray read the ledger line twice before he said a single word. "Man doesn't write water in a deed," he said finally, "unless somebody once carried a bucket to that exact spot." They worked the site together for 6 days, cut back the cedar roots that had grown down to the buried stonework, found under a slab Walter had assumed was just another loose rock, the top of a stone-lined box, hand-built, the kind of structure a man made once in his life when a spring needed protecting from silt and stock. 40 years of leaf litter had packed into that box, so tight it sealed the water in rather than let it flow. They cleared out by hand, opened the old clay overflow channel, laid fresh gravel, fitted a screen over the mouth, and ran a line down the slope to a used stock tank Walter bought off a neighbor for $40. The water didn't come back all at once. It came back the way trapped water always does, slow, patient, like it had been waiting a whole 40 years for somebody to finally ask. Walter ran the numbers on a legal pad the night before he called the bank. A drilled well, $12,000 to $14,500. Money he didn't have, and the bank wouldn't lend against improving land anyway. Hauling water through a full Texas summer, close to $4,300, not counting fuel or the hours it stole from every single day. Restoring the Split Oak Spring, start to finish, $60 in courthouse copies, $340 for raised time and materials, $210 in hand clearing labor, $180 in gravel and pipe, $150 for the tank, $140 for fence wire to keep the cattle off the spring box itself. Total cost, just under $1,100. Flow rate, once the box was clear, just under 2 gallons a minute, close to 2,800 gallons a day. Enough, properly stored, to water 30 head in rotation without ever running the trough dry. The adjuster came back out on day 26. Same clipboard, same flat voice, until he saw the trough. Full, clear, cold, even in the August heat, with 11 head of cattle standing around it like nothing had ever been wrong with that ranch at all. That from the deed, he asked. The split oak thing? From the split oak, Walter said. He didn't say much more than that. He didn't need to. The county reappraised the ranch that fall. Before the spring, it had value between $17,000 and $19,500 for 140 acres of dry hill country nobody wanted. After, with a documented, permitted, working water source on record, it appraised between $34,000 and $38,000, more than double. The drought bond went through in 11 days. The bank never called a note. The neighbor who'd once joked that Walter was wasting a good spring digging up a dead tree stood at that same fence line months later, looking at the split oak stump differently than he had in July. Always figured that was just where an old tree fell over, he said. It's where somebody stopped to drink, Walter told him. Man just wrote it down so the next person would remember. The split oak had been dead for 40 years by the time Walter found it. No trunk left standing, just a dark patch of ground, a ring of saplings, and 6 words in a dead man's pencil that everybody else had read as decoration. Old wording, but once it had been working language. Men wrote down what mattered: cornerstone, deer trail, split oak, water, and they trusted somebody, someday, would need it enough to read it right. The bank had seen no well. The county had seen no record. The neighbors had seen a dead tree. Walter saw the one word that didn't belong there, unless somebody once had stopped to fill a bucket. He followed it, and in August, when the creeks ran dry and the whole county hauled water at $60 a day, the split oak watered cattle again. If a story like this is worth the 10 minutes it took to watch, there's a subscribe button waiting below. And we'd love to know, in the comments, would you have trusted a 100-year-old sentence written in pencil over a modern survey map?